In this lesson, we're going to examine two features of the book of Acts. First, we'll examine the preface to the Gospel of Luke so that we can understand the author's goals in writing these two books. Second, we'll examine the three types of unity that tie together the Gospel of Luke and Acts. Luke begins his Gospel with the preface, in which he explains how he wrote the book and what he intended to accomplish. If he knew that he was going to write Acts as he wrote his Gospel, then the goals described in this preface also guided his writing of Acts. Here is what he writes in this preface. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the teachings accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. Let's begin by noting several characteristics of this preface. First, it is written in good Hellenistic Greek. It is a long, continuous sentence in the Greek, which often is broken up in our English translations because the attention span of us moderns is so short. Second, Luke follows the pattern of ancient literary prologues. He follows the conventions of writing history in his day. Third, he is stating his own sentiments. This is one of the rare times in his writings that he allows the reader to see directly into his mind. Fourth, although he addresses the work to a certain Theophilus, it is evident that he intended his work for a wider audience. Fifth, he states that he intends to write a narrative, a diegesis, according to the standards of his time. In this preface, we can discern that Luke sets out three goals for his writing. The first goal is accuracy. He recognized that Theophilus has already received reliable instruction. His own writing doesn't undermine or contradict the accuracy of that information. Rather, he intends to confirm the truth of the facts that Theophilus has already learned. His second goal is competence. Luke himself was not an eyewitness of all these events, so he investigated the facts. Many speculate that perhaps he conducted this research during the 2 years that Paul spent in prison in Caesarea. He indicates that he utilized two kinds of sources, eyewitnesses and written documents. He also sets out to write an orderly narrative, which probably does not refer to strict chronological order, as the New American Standard Bible translation suggests. It is orderly in that it is easy to follow and makes sense to the reader. Third, his work is reliable. It can be trusted. He bases his work, primarily referring to the gospel, on that of predecessors, so there is a solid foundation for his writing. He doesn't invent stories, but passes down traditions that were handed down to him by eyewitnesses. Also, he strives to show in his account that the events he describes were planned and carried out by God, therefore they can be believed. I have already suggested that Luke's preface probably extends as well to Acts, since he intended from the beginning to write a 2-volume work. Mark Allen Powell, in his book What Are They Saying About Acts, has suggested that we find three types of unity that tie together the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. The first type of unity is authorial. The same author wrote both works. Before 1927, students of the New Testament often viewed the Gospel of Luke and Acts as two separate books, because they were separated in the canon by the Gospel of John. But then Henry J. Cadbury published the first edition of the Making of Luke Acts, in which he revealed the literary and theological unity of the book. We need to remember that originally the New Testament writings existed on scrolls. Each of the books would have filled a typical scroll of the time. When the Gospels were collected and bound together in a codex, the Gospel of John was placed in the fourth position. So in our canon today, Luke's two works are separated. Acts was placed after the Gospels because it serves as the bridge between the Gospels and Paul's letters. Cadbury reminded people to overlook the placement of these books in our modern canon and to view them as a two-volume work. Since his study, scholars refer to these books as Luke, Acts with the hyphen connecting them. The second type of unity is theological. One example of a scholar who has emphasized this type of unity is Robert O'Toole. He argues that the unifying theme that runs through Luke Acts is salvation provided by God. The Gospel of Luke shows how God provided salvation through Jesus. Acts, on the other hand, shows how the true Israel, the church, receives that salvation. The third type of unity is narrative unity. A number of scholars have highlighted this aspect. For example, H.J. Cadbury argued that Acts was not an appendix or afterthought to the Gospel of Luke. Instead, Luke knew that he was going to write Acts when he began writing the Gospel. Cadbury says that Acts was an integral part of the author's original plan and purpose. Charles Talbert is an example of a later scholar who showed how Luke tied together his two works by using literary devices such as parallelism. He discerned recurring patterns between the two books. Here is a list of some of the parallels between the two books. Both have a preface. Both describe a descent of the Spirit. Both include a healing of a lame man, conflicts with religious leaders, a feast at the house of a centurion, a story about a widow and resurrection, and missionary journeys to Jerusalem. Both narratives end with a journey to Jerusalem and an arrest. Luke intentionally sets up numerous parallels between Jesus and Paul. Robert Tannehill wrote a two-volume commentary on Luke Acts in which he highlighted the narrative threads that tie the works together. He shows that Acts completes the story that Luke began in his Gospel. For example, promises made in the Gospel are fulfilled in Acts. He argues that apart from Acts, the Gospel would be incomplete, and apart from the Gospel, Acts would be misunderstood. In the next lesson, we'll discuss Acts as a work of literature and as a work of history.